Welcome to this guest lecture for the Master of Science Circular Economy at Han University. My name is Jan Janssen and I will guide you through this presentation. How is our agenda looking? Well, we start with introduction, then the coffee market, the true cost price of coffee, the supply chain of coffee, some results based on case studies, discussion, and at the end, the references. Well, from your study program, I made a copy of some important learning outcomes, probably well known to you. It's about how you develop as a change agent in a context of circular economy sustainability. And for that you see the well-known topics you already had in semester 1 and the topics you now have in semester 2. I'm filling the gap a little bit with my lecture on true costing in a multipolar VUCA world. What is exactly a change agent, and especially in the context of circular economy? Well, you know from a lot of textbooks or articles you read that you can talk a lot, but it's also about doing. And there you see the issue in trying to implement it in organizations. Maybe not in the large companies, but especially in small and medium-sized enterprises, in which often graduates of a University of Applied Science will find their future job. In an article I just read, you see that there are a lot of, let's say, roles of a change agent. That can be in a strategic level, that can be in more internal support, that can be in some operations, but also in a more technical role, and of course in informal roles you can play an important role in change as a change agent, but also externally. So you see here 6 types, and maybe there are more, but it's just a first idea of your future job. And well, in the true pricing issue, I will come back on that later. What is true costing? True pricing? It's not so easy. So that's why I start with a very down-to-earth example of probably well-known coffee beans. Now Airbus, part of a multinational company, by the way, and there you see if you buy coffee in a supermarket, and I got it from Albert Heijn in the Netherlands, that you pay around 20 euros for a kilo. That's of course excluding VAT. If you would calculate it using the tool of true pricing of the true price organization, that will be probably a bit higher, around 25. And here I assume that the profit margin in euros is the same, 6 euro. But there you see that the environmental costs play a role and the social costs. How that is calculated is another issue. I will come back on that during the presentation. Just a little bit of economics, and probably you are quite familiar with supply and demand curves from a long time ago. You see in the left part of the graphical presentation where demand meets supply, and there we got an equilibrium price. What about true pricing? Well, you know from the previous slide that the true price should be a little bit higher. So that's why I plotted the dotted line parallel to the original supply curve, and then you get a higher price. Now the question is, who will receive this money? Is that, let's say, the retailer at the end, for instance Albert Heijn, or are that the original producers, the farmers of coffee? Well, in my expose I will discuss this, of course, in more detail. From the theory, we know, of course, that the equilibrium price, as you can see, there we are here, has a consumer's surplus and a producer surplus. So a consumer surplus and a producer surplus. What will happen now when you increase the price using the previous graph with the dotted line? You get a new equilibrium, and then you see that the consumer surplus is lower. The producer surplus is more or less the same, a little change, there's a dead weight loss. And we know that there is now a value for the externalities. And the question is, what will happen with this money? Will it go back to the, let's say, original farmers, or it will be additional profit somewhere? That's often the discussion in calculating true prices. Who will get this gain? Some information about coffee. Probably you know that there's a coffee belt, and let's say that's in the more tropical part of the world, Africa, the South Americas, Indonesia, Vietnam, and there is the coffee produced. And a lot of coffee is consumed also in that area, but also in the northern hemisphere. For instance, the United States, Canada, Europe, Russia. So there you find the consumers. If you look to the coffee market, we see that the production is in a tropical area, and it uses the environment, first of all soil, and often you use for that also former forests. You use a lot of water, and well, what we know about labor, we see that a lot of negative things on labor is included over there. Low wages, child labor, often also kind of slavery, and very poor labor conditions. On the demand side, the coffee market is very fragmented. We see multinational companies, the well-known ones. We see a lot of domestic small and medium-sized enterprises. In the Dutch case, you see here a few of them. And Pace, for instance, in this region, Pelican also in this region, and VUCA in Nijmegen is also part of the Arnhem region. The coffee price, as you can see, it's quite volatile, and it's increasing the last, let's say, years, and that also explains why the coffee price in the supermarket or the coffee price in the restaurant is increasing a lot. Just to give you some idea about the structure of the coffee price in the supply chain, we see that retail gets the most part of it. So let's say companies like Albert Heijn, but also other, let's say, retail organizations, they receive a lot of the coffee price. Distribution only 1%, roasting often done in the northern hemisphere around 30%, exporting 6%, and the growing is only 2%. So a very small amount of the kilogram price is going to the original farmer. Just to give you some idea about what we are talking about, in my research in November 2025, the world market prices was about €7 a kilo, and there you see the price of some, let's say, brands, especially the multinationals, Douwe Egberts, Perla, Starbucks. You see that is without VAT, of course, around 16, 18, 27 euros. Starbucks is very high price, as you can see. If you look also to, let's say, the small and medium-sized enterprises of the case study, they're around, the top of them are around the 30, 34, 24, 25, around 19. And if you go to a, let's say, restaurant, you need only 10 grams of coffee, and that's a price of around €3, 3.50. That means if you recalculate it to a kilo price, it's 300, 350. So especially if you buy coffee in a restaurant or a bar, a coffee bar, you pay a very high price per kilo, but that you probably already knew from the prices at your university as well. What about true pricing? Well, in my research, I can show you a lot of more, let's say in detail, information about how to come to this overview. We see that there are two parts of the true price. The willingness to pay, which is in fact part of the consumer surplus I showed you a few slides ago. And the true price is based on two aspects: monetizing the external cost of the environmental damage and pollution, and the fair payment of wages. And of course, the monetizing of the external costs is calculated by using shadow price techniques based on linear programming, marginal costing or grensplanningskostenrechnung, and the estimation techniques of, let's say, the true price organization. The price of labor is determined by the wages, the income of the farmer, for instance, and the labor conditions, respectively child labor. But also the price of a loan can play a role, and the price of energy can play a role. As already mentioned a few times, the True Price Foundation has a nice tool to calculate the true price, and the price gap based on social costs and on environmental costs I just showed you. They are put in that model to calculate not only for coffee but also for a lot of other products the true price. Also, they did a nice case study on buying jeans. What do we know about the supply chain of coffee? Well, we have, let's say, traditional patterns going back to the colonial times, maybe the 17th, 18th century, 19th century. There are focal companies, like for instance J.B. Peet, Dow Edwards, Nestlé. Small and medium-sized enterprises, they play a very modest role. And the supply chain itself differs a lot. There are small farmers, family business, there are small and large cooperative structures, syndicates, and large plantations. As I already mentioned, the world market price is very volatile, and the influence of climate change is getting more and more relevant. From a old textbook, I copied this one, and sorry for the Dutch, but I translated it right away into English. We see the staple market of the VUCA, one of the first multinationals in the Netherlands, based on the Dutch East Indian Company, where they created such a trade pattern, and this trade pattern is still relevant in the 21st century. So very, let's say, stable, based on, let's say, an old colonial structure. If you look to the supply chain in a very simplified way, we see that the farmer plays has a role, and this was the farmer in Colombia, and he calculated in peso. Of course, there are cooperatives involved. They also calculated in pesos. There's an exporter, and there we see the first let's say, exchange risk, the peso-dollar risk. Then it is shipped to, for instance, Western Europe. There the importer is having a next risk, the dollar-euro risk. And then the importer, often combined with the roaster, calculates in euros, and then it goes to the retail. This is a simplified overview, but it's important to see how the chain is organized. And of course, you can make it more and more complex, but this is the core thing of this supply chain. We see also a role of, let's say, financing, where, for instance, based on a publication of the World Bank, we see that the focal company, often a multinational, is pre-financing the harvest. So the farmers are more or less tied to the focal company, because they are depending on loans, because they want to live, to pay their rent and stuff like that, to buy food for the children. But they didn't harvest yet, they didn't sold it yet, so that's why this pre-financing, this pre-harvest financing is playing an important role. From a German study, we see again a similar approach. And sorry for the German words, but it was for me impossible to translate it right away. So I used the German overview. In my article, of course, I explained it, of course, in English as well. And we see here that there's a deep tire finance between the roasters of the multinational companies and the farmers. In the previous slide was more or less the same conclusion. Two of my former students from Vietnam, they plotted the supply chain of coffee in Vietnam, which is a little bit different organized. But in fact, all aspects are in it. In my article about coffee, I explain, of course, in more detail this overview of Mr. Nguyen and Le, where it plays a role. And then, of course, in Vietnam, it's a bit different organized. It depends also on the different economic system they have over there. But Vietnam is a very developing market, very fast growing market, not only for coffee, but also for a lot of other products. Well, we live in a VUCA world. I assume you are aware of this acronym, and that means that companies, they have in fact 5 aspects they try to manage. That's of course the service level, the costs, and of course the capital, the net operating working capital they would like to allocate. And nowadays, for logistics companies, for supply chain companies, sustainability plays an important role, /circularity. I often don't know exactly the difference. And of course, how to deal with risk and resilience. And that plays in a VUCA world where there's a lot of volatility, uncertainty, chaos, plays an important role. And it's about the resilience of a supply chain, of an individual company, that is important. If you look to the economic systems in the world, we see in fact a few one. The classical, neoclassical market economy, or the Anglo-Saxon model, the social market economy, some aspects of the planned economy, and the third way solutions. Anyway, there's not only one dominant system anymore, and that's not only let's say the past years, that's already for a lot of decades, but in this case, it's quite important that we see also that the supply chain of coffee has to deal with that. And that is an important aspect if you look at the production factors. Well, from traditional theory, we know there's nature, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship that play a role. You are familiar with the 6 capitals of Gleason White, or the IIRC: natural capital, intellectual capital, human capital, social relationship capital, financial capital, and manufactured capital. And using the donut model, triple P of Elkington, we see planet, people, and profit. And in fact, it is summarized in the 3 colors I have over here. A little bit green one, the nature, including the planet and the planetary boundaries, the stewardship, the ecosystems, labor in all sorts of forms, not only the, let's say, the technical labor like manual labor, intellectual labor, but also the human capital and the social relationship capital, but also issues around ethics and social boundaries. And then finally, capital, not only the financial capital, but also the manufactured capital plays a role, and how to deal with the profit using, for instance, the Rhineland business model with long-term orientation, where you focus on stakeholders' value, and especially the role of the entrepreneur is important. He or she is combining the production factors, but also taking risks and starting with innovation. This brings me to a last publication I just finished. How do economists look at costs? And especially some economists called management accountants, they are quite interested in this overview. Well, it started a long time ago where we used management accounting from the bookkeeping system. Then it developed also, the bookkeeping system developed in the industrial area and let's say the early 20th century. In the 1950s and later we developed a lot of new, let's say, management accounting tools which are maybe familiar for you, like activity-based costing, life cycle costing, stuff like that. And in the 1980s, 1990s, we looked also to quality costs, prevention costs, lean costs, balanced scorecard, where you look at the non-financial data. And then, let's say, developing into the early part of this age, new impacts on information technology plays a role, forecasting, data science, cloud computing. And finally, this, let's say, light purple color, we see management accounting 5, where we look at true cost accounting. We try to monetize social costs, environmental costs, using techniques, all techniques like shadow pricing, linear programming, cost benefit analysis, GPK, just name them, multi-capital accounting. And this is not yet implemented, but more and more companies are getting familiar with this, and especially the new generation of students of a bachelor level or a master's level. They should know the techniques and the line of reasoning, the way of thinking. It's in fact a paradigm shift. In my article that soon will be published, you can read more about that. And the summary of the article you find right away here, where I focus on the paradigm shift from the traditional neoclassical way of thinking into the way of thinking that could be summarized like circular economy or similar words. And yeah, this means that the business context is changing. If I look to my own studies, when I had your age, it was limits to growth, the Club of Rome in the 1980s. And it developed gradually into ESG, SDG, P, VUCA, IT, and data science. And this is probably not the end of the trends that are playing a role, but for sure that is another way of thinking about how to calculate cost prices. And as you can see, management accounting, they still think in direct costs, indirect costs, but nowadays also they include environmental costs and social costs. And at the end, of course, a company has to make profit. Then you have the true selling price, which is a bit different than this one. And there you see the price gap from the beginning of 1 kilo of coffee, by the way. So what's the true price? Well, as you can see, there are 3 elements. The traditional cost price, but also social costs and environmental costs. And they play an important role in the way of thinking of cost prices, of true cost prices. We have a lot of hidden internal costs, and I don't going to mention this slide step by step, but it's clear that a lot of costs are not officially registered. They are still made, they are paid, but they are not assigned to a product or a service. And that's where, let's say, in management accounting, it plays an important role to do that. The external costs, they're often also not registered. And in my, let's say, article, I focused only on the costs, the negative external effects created by production, like pollution, deforestation, waste, excessive use of water, etc. That brings me to an important, let's say, overview where we try to make a balance between three aspects. That is the traditional cost accounting, the social costs, and the environmental costs. And we try to align profit, people, planet. Like you probably also learned in your, let's say, studies in the masters, but it's also the challenge. It's very simple in one way, but also very difficult in another way, very complex. Just to give you one idea, in my article I wrote about this, a supply chain and how we calculate the costs. And this overview is not really shared with, let's say, consumers at the end, so they know where profits are made. And companies don't want to share this type of information. Some of them do, but not many. And that brings me to an important triangle. If we would like to implement true cost as a methodology, we know that the consumers, they are willingly to pay, and they have a change in ethical behavior. They would like to pay more. We also know that entrepreneurs that especially use the Rhineland business model, the stewardship ideas and ethical behavior as well, they also would like to implement this. And we expect national legislation, so for instance in the Netherlands, but also supranational legislation, for instance in the EU. On the level of the World Trade Organization, I'm a bit more, let's say, pessimistic, but also depends on the multipolar, let's say, economic world we live in. If you look at the results of my study, and I will share with you that at the end in the references, some of the case studies are often greenwashing, just a little bit of PR, how well they are doing, but in fact nothing is happening. The other one I concluded is there's a lack of true cost price information in the supply chain. Companies don't want to share it, or it's not available. So the true cost price, as you could see in this overview, is still for the farmers a very low amount. It's depending on how you measure this. This one is 3%, and the former one we had 2%. But there is still the issue, and the rest of the chain is earning a lot of money. By the way, the roasters, the retailers, the importers, the exporters, the cooperatives. In my research, I try to make a kind of, let's say, matrix to make it clear where the external costs and the social costs could be found, and how to share that. This is not well common in a lot of, let's say, supply chains. Even for the companies in the case studies I mentioned, the 5 companies in the Netherlands, they don't use it. So that's still a far road to go, actually, in changing mentality of companies to be open for this. Let's as you know where your product comes from. It's also interesting to see how the price structure is there. Let's make a small final first conclusion. It's not so easy to define true costs, to measure them, and especially what sort of externalities we would like to use. I focused only on one. There's lack of transparency, and the question if fintech, distributed ledger technology can play a role. And the other one is, can we make the coffee supply chain more resilient and to absorb all kinds of shocks, especially for the farmer. At the end, I would like to mention something about this thing of different economic systems we live in a multipolar world. Based on an old study of Grossman, but still very relevant, by the way, he looks at a few criteria, and he tries to map that in a fully central planned economy, which doesn't exist anymore, and a fully free market economy, which still probably exists in a few countries, and a lot of mixed economies. And those are the three well-known ones: market socialism, social Rhineland economy, and the Anglo-Saxon market economy. And then we see, let's say, based on those criteria, we see that Korea, the Democratic People's Republic, is somewhere centrally, China, Vietnam, the former USSR, mixed economies in an Anglo-Saxon world, and a fully free market economy. This is not very exact rocket science, but just an impression to see how the world is defined in different, let's say, sectors. That brings me back to one of the first slides I shared with you. We have a multipolar world based on a few, let's say, blocks, and we have a lot of incidents happening, and well, you know them of course all. And the question is how you, let's say, act as a change agent in that, let's say, very hectic international world. If I look ahead and I'm looking at the year 2100, I see a change based on some data of the OECD, and I see a change in average growth rate in a lot of companies, very high growth rates. But I also see the share in the world economy. India, USA, China, but we see also Southeast Asia, countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, but also the sub-Saharan Sahara countries like large countries like Nigeria, Republic of South Africa, they also play a role. So we see a lot of changing in the world for the coming decades. And that is visualized over here. The question is if China or India is that correct, but based on the assumptions of the OECD, I have to plot it like this, but maybe it's a bit too optimistic, I don't know. What about growth rates? Well, we see that the growth rate doubles every 70 divided by the average growth rate in percentage in years. So if the growth rate is 1%, we need 70 years to double. But if it's, let's say, 5 years, it's only 14 years. And based on those, let's say, rates, and starting with a number of 100, we see a lot of possible models of growth in the world. And that brings me back to the slide I showed you already a few times. What is that for you? You're now around, let's say, 25. In 25 years, you're 50. You probably have a child. And in 2075, you are retired, having again a child still, but the child is already 50. And you have a grandchild, probably 25. And assume you will be 100. Your child will be 75, the grandchild will be 50, and the great-grandchild will be 25. So you are thinking of making decisions that play a role for, let's say, a few generations in terms of how do you leave the planet to the next generations. That's the core thing of stewardship. Well, it depends also how you look at growth. Is it linear growth? Is it exponential growth? Is it logistics growth? With, let's say, a ceiling, like we see in the discussions of the donut economy, or is it like the limits to growth economy, like the Rome Club? Is it like this, that we will have a negative growth? Well, to be honest, I don't know. I share with you some information. And also invite you, if you have maybe written your thesis already, make a summary, and you can share that in the London International Conference against a very modest fee for the students. So you get the discount, and contact Professor Dr. Selim Özdemir. And I will show you a few of my writings that can help you to understand what is true price of coffee, with a lot of references, by the way. The first article I already quoted a few times is the true cost price of coffee, but I also wrote one together with Rob Westerdijk about future-proof entrepreneurship, the OK method with the 6 capitals. True costing in logistics and supply chain management, how do we make decisions based on true economic trade-offs, especially for electric trucks, and my glossary for free as well, where you can look up a lot of, let's say, concepts on circular economy with the original sources. Anyway, thank you for your attention, and let's have now a discussion.